I want to share a little with you tonight about the journey that the church has been on. I read a book recently by Steve Addison, and his book was called Movements That Change the World. And it's really looking at how the Christian church as a movement has made significant impact. But he says this, he says, the church Jesus founded was a missionary church. Its existence and activities were an expression of its missionary calling. You think about that and you think, well, that's true. You know, the DNA of the Christian church is mission. Hasn't changed. Then he goes on and he says this. He says its members were fearlessly determined to win others to faith in Jesus as the crucified and risen Messiah. What I find interesting in that little section there, it says they were fearlessly determined. And I ask myself, what does that mean? What did that look like in the early Christian church? And what does it look like today? Is the church today fearlessly determined? Has the missionary focus of the church changed at all? Has it become blunted in some way? Are our members fearlessly determined to win others for Christ? Or have we sort of become somewhat institutionalised and we just go to church, have our programs, and have forgotten that the church's purpose is at base missionary? Addison continues and he outlines three distinctive purposes of the mission-focused movement. I want to share those with you. The first is this. He says, as a missionary movement, our message centres on Jesus Christ, the Son of God who was crucified for our sins and is the only source of salvation for a lost world. And we know that. That's I guess 101. Number two, as a missionary movement, we have an agenda for change. You know, one thing we don't want is to leave people where they are. We're driven by this sense that the world needs to do something better. It needs Jesus Christ. The corruption of sin needs to be challenged. The question is, how do you do that? And in the context we live in New Zealand, how do we do that? And so some of the things we look at when we look at secular postmodern society helps us to ask the question, how do we do it in that context? How can we be relevant? And then number three, mission involves the conversion of individuals and their inclusion into the body of Christ, which is the church, the people of God. Then he says there is no mission without the church and there is no discipleship without the community of faith. And I want you to think about that for a minute, because it's talking to us about the importance of the church. I'd like to think there that he's talking about the local church, and that the church stands at the centre of both mission and discipleship. It's the heart and core, because it's the local church that sits at the cutting edge of mission. The success in both mission and discipleship depends on the church working effectively, being effective. The problem is we don't really know what that looks like. We've got some ideas. How do we measure it? How do we determine whether we've been more effective or less effective? Do we ask ourselves those questions? And then driving the activity and business of the church is what we call the Great Commission. The work we have collectively of sharing the gospel and influencing people from all areas of life for eternity. I find that Jesus was very clear about this, and you'll read through the New Testament and you'll find this commission or this task that he's given the church in many places. You know, we're familiar with Matthew 28. We find it in other places of the gospel like Mark. We see it restated in Acts chapter 1 where he talks about, waiting in Jerusalem and then going to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the world with the gospel. It's all a restatement of the gospel commission. And it's interesting, it's what the church has to share that sets it apart from everyone else. I read a book once that said, the world can do things probably as well, if not better than the church in most things. But there is one thing that the church does better than anyone else. Do you know what that is? Sharing grace. Well, it ought to be better. Sharing grace. Now, what's grace? It's the story of Jesus. It's what God has done for us. It's all about forgiveness and the message of life and hope and redemption. This is what defines our mission and sets the church apart. And so the question the church has asked itself is, how do we do this? How do we do the work that God has given us? And so when we start looking at vision and strategy and those kinds of things, that's our attempt to try and answer the question, how do we move God's church forward? Now, down through the years, the church has responded in different ways. And you may remember some of these things. Who remembers the 1,000 days of reaping? Okay? Who remembers Harvest 90? That one caused a real problem for the church, particularly when I was working in P&G. Because some thought that when 1990 came, which was what Harvest 90 was happening, the harvest would happen and Jesus would come. And so to try to get the eschatology right for some of those folk was a bit of a challenge. Then we had one called Global Mission. And it's interesting, I was out in the country or in a village way out in the back blocks of P&G to run some meetings. And they had this big sign up. They're very progressive. Unfortunately, they spelt global wrong and it came out gobble. I didn't have the heart to tell them. Global Mission. And more recently, we've had Reach the World, which is now Tell the World, is it? That's what it used to be. And under those, there was Reach Up to God, Reach In with God, and Reach Out with God. So these have been the General Conference themes. They're strategic platforms for answering the question, how do we do the work of God in the world? Then commencing in 2011, the World Church engaged in a process of review which formed the foundation for what was to become the General Conference Strategic Plan. And they have a really nice little book which outlines their strategic plan. And this review was quite extensive. They surveyed around 41,000 people. And then an additional 1,000 people who were no longer coming to church. In other words, missing or lost members. And this research highlighted a number of positive things they found, but also some things that the church needed to give attention to. Now, I want to just share with you 4 of those things that the church needed to give attention to. This one's number 3. Notice here, many local churches lack robust mechanisms for member care, especially for those who are at risk of leaving the church. While the number of church members has grown significantly over the past 50 years, in the same period, 4 out of 10 of all members have left the church. There is an evident need for comprehensive member care strategies to enhance the experience in the local church family and thus improve membership retention patterns. Now, I think we probably knew that. But the survey that they took actually reinforced it and confirmed that what we were thinking was true. The really stunning thing, 4 out of 10. 4 out of 10. Number 4. There is also a need to instill lifelong commitment to membership in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Discipleship programs should be greatly strengthened. Number 5, secular thinking and entertainment are affecting Adventist beliefs and practices, especially in the Western world. True? It's a challenge, huge challenge. You know, when you look at the last census, it showed us that New Zealand is now no longer a Christian country. There are less Christians in New Zealand than there are secular and others. Number 6, there is a decline in most divisions of personal commitment to participation in vital personal, I can't say that word, and corporate spiritual practices, especially in personal Bible study and family worship. You know, and there's one that goes to the heart of discipleship. So these were some of the things that were found as they conducted the survey from across the world. Now, as you look at those, the question you need to ask is, what do they say about my church? As I read those 4 areas through, did you identify with any of them? Did any bells go off and say in your heads, that's something I see in my church. That's a challenge or an issue in my church. You know, as I look at them, I think that here is some of the essence of Adventism that is missing. And that there needs to be a greater focus on a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, it's my dream, my vision, I suppose, that as a church we are passionate Christians. We are passionate about serving Jesus Christ. Church isn't just something we do. And as I look at these things, I wonder whether some of those things have been lost. There is no mission without the church, and there is no discipleship without the community of faith. You know, as you look at the early church, you see a church that is on fire. You see a church that's passionate. In Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, you see the disciples go out and preach. People come into the church. And it talks about them there in verse 42, 43, 44, about them meeting together, studying together, praying together, sharing in common together, sharing their faith, going from door to door. It's a story that shows what discipleship is like. It shows what the church was like. It's interesting to me then when I move on to Ephesians chapter 4, and it talks about the church, about building the church up. But as you read through that chapter 4, it also talks about an active church. And it tells us that a church that is passionate, a church that is involved, is a church that is busy and active doing God's work. And so I'd encourage you to read those chapters, have a look at them, think about them carefully as you read them through, because they give us clues as to what God wants for His church and what discipleship looks like in that early church period. It gives you the picture of what the General Conferences term total membership involvement, because that's what you see. That's the picture you see. And at the core of this is the issue of discipleship. How do we follow Jesus? How do we live in relationship with God and each other? How do we keep our relationships alive, vital, passionate and active? And how do we share Jesus Christ with others? Then in 2014, the division began to look forward to its next quinquennium and began to ask itself, what are we going to do? The first thing it did was it began to look at its resources, and this is what it found. How is the division using its resources? And it's interesting down here. Low growth, maintenance, support and training was where 82% of its resources was going. And then when you look over here, discipleship, high growth opportunity, 6%. That's a bit of a challenge. You'd like to see more resources in that area, wouldn't you? You'd think so. And so they looked at that and they asked themselves, what can we do? How can we change this picture so that our resources are more strategically deployed or used to benefit the church? And so they came up with a strategy that looks like this. They asked themselves, what are the real big game changes that we need to be addressing? And the first one they said was discipleship. We need to have a focus on family, church and school. We need to see education as discipleship. We need to be working in this area because out of that grows all that the church does. The next major area was comprehensive health ministry. You know, as a church, this is something we've been pretty good at, health. And when you think about health, what better way do we have of actually being involved in our communities? What better entry do we have into secular society than actually talking about something that's meaningful to people and talking to them about things we know about? And so health has become a major focal area. Then comes media, looking at media. Now I guess the question here is, how do you get into people's homes? Now I've told this before, but when I was starting to come to New Zealand, I was sitting in my hotel room one night and on the television came this advertisement. And the ad said, "We don't come to your doors anymore." Have you seen it? I think it was an insurance or some ad like that. And it was extolling the virtue that we're not going to bother you at your door. We've got other ways of doing it. And I thought to myself, what's that saying about New Zealand society? And what's that saying about the whole, I guess, evangelism process where we knock on people's doors and we try and influence in some way? And it raised the question in my mind, then if we don't do that, then how do we do it? How do we get into the 4.5 million people's homes across New Zealand? And you know, media is really one of those platforms that we can do that in. The idea of being in everyone, or the possibility of being in everyone's homes 24/7, every day of the year, is such a tremendous blessing, a great opportunity. And so comprehensive media is so important. And then finally comes mission to the cities. So these were the division's 4 major game changers. And so they thought, well, we're going to start channeling our resources into these 4 key areas. And then we come to the union. And so as a union, we began to look at the same thing and asking ourselves the same question. This is what our resource distribution looked like. Not much different to the divisions. This is how we spent our money. And we thought we need to do better than that. We need to change it. Because up in that 6.5 area is where we want to see more resources put. Okay, that's the size of our budget. So as we thought of these things, what were our key objectives? First one, discipling every member. I think we'd be selling ourselves short if we didn't think about every member being passionate for Jesus Christ. Number two, taking the gospel to every home. That's our purpose. That's what God has asked us to do. And number three, positioning the church in the community as the primary spiritual lifestyle provider. There's a lot of stuff packed into those words. But simply what it means is that your churches are to become centres of influence. Your churches are to make a significant contribution to the life of the communities in which they exist. Why are they there? Are they there simply to serve ourselves, or are they there to serve the community? What are you known for in the community as a church? Are you simply known to be that group of people there doing something we don't know? Or are you seen as a community that's contributing in some way? And so people know the Adventists are the ones we go to see this for, or we go to see this for. They provide this service for our community, etc. So we've got to start looking at these things and saying, how do we do that? How do we make our churches significant to the lives of the communities in which they exist? And so they're the three key objectives that we're looking at as we look at our strategic direction as a church. And then we came and looked at, again, what were going to be the game changers. And like the division, we have chosen the same four. And the reason we've chosen the same four is because they make sense. They're the things we do well. They're the things that actually have maximum impact. So why would we choose to do something different? And as we look at these things, discipleship, we've developed a model that talks about us and our own growth in Jesus Christ. And I think, Victor, you're going to talk about this? Okay, so he's going to talk about it. 4 basic objectives: to know, commit, live and share. Very simple. Do you know Jesus Christ personally? Are you connected to him? Are you committed to him in his church? Do you live the values of Christianity in the way you relate to others? And do you share your love for Jesus with those around you? 4 basic things. The second one, health ministry. 3 basic objectives. Healthy leaders and healthy churches. Objective number 1, are we practicing what we preach? How can we tell others if we don't do it ourselves? Number 2, there's some things. Number 2, healthy communities. How do we help our communities to know about better health for themselves? And so we're looking at healthy schools, Maori, Pacifica, older people, and structured health programs to support you in churches to run programs in your communities and to have some significant contribution there. So they're the 2 objectives for health. Then number 3 is media ministry. And we're looking at these objectives. Partnering with conferences and missions in developing a presence in all Union territories. How do we do that? Objective 2, operating Hope Channel as a 24/7 television station in New Zealand. And Damien gave the good news. April 30, we will be launching Hope Channel across New Zealand on the terrestrial platform. Everyone will be able to see Hope Channel. The good news is we're getting responses for Hope Channel. I'm getting emails all the time on Facebook. We're getting people through our Bible school and people coming into church. So people are watching. I had a story. One of our board members, she went to her hairdresser or beautician or something, and she's sitting in the chair. Now, I haven't been to one, so I don't know what the chairs are like. But she's sitting in the chair and the lady asks, "Oh, what have you been doing this week?" And she just tells her this and that, and then she says, "Oh, I was on the Hope Channel board." And this lady says, "Hope Channel? I've been watching Hope Channel." And our board member thought she might have had it mixed up. And so they talked a bit further and said, yeah, that's the one that started in September. And then she told her that her father had been watching Hope Channel and all his church had been watching Hope Channel. So we know people are watching. And we expect over time to see some positive things. I guess Novo Tempo, Clever? Sleeping, okay. Yes. Your church in Brazil very much worked with Novo Tempo, and I visited your church.
Our outreach services broadcast.
Yes, yeah, very successfully too. And then finally, we want to implement a branding strategy for the church, which has to do with church signage. And we're having a little bit of a hold up there because the colour up in the corner there is creating a little bit of an issue for some. And then finally, the last one is mission to our communities. And we believe every community needs to have some kind of missionary outreach. So we're looking at partnering with conferences and missions to refocus and reposition for church outreach. We're looking at partnering with conferences and missions to establish churches as centres of influence through the establishment of community outreach programs, and also establishing strategies for evangelism that builds on these outreach programs. So how do we bridge from here to here? How do we do it in a way that seems seamless and that can do it in a contextually appropriate manner? So they are the things that we're looking at the Union. That's the strategic plan that we have. And now our question is, how do we make this successful in our partnerships with our conferences and missions? And how does it help you in your local church? What do you need to help you achieve these four important areas? Discipling members, using our health ministry as the right arm of the gospel, leveraging the media opportunities that have been created, and mission to your communities. How do you help your churches to be those centres of influence, being relevant in the communities, being known for something that adds value, being the go-to place? You know, I often believe, or actually believe, that when you gain confidence in one area, it will build a stepping stone for confidence in another. And so we don't necessarily have to, go into a community with an evangelistic program as an entering area. We can do it in some of these other areas, build relationships, build confidence, and then the other opportunities will find their natural place. We need to be challenged to change. We need to ask ourselves, what are we doing well? But we also need to ask ourselves, what aren't we doing well? And how do we affect change in that area so that we can be fulfilling as effectively as possible the work that God has given us as a church to do? Well, this is a journey, and we're looking forward to being on this journey together. The cutting edge is the church, the local church. Unfortunately, we're back at the Union, and we've got to work as best we can to provide the resources and the support that you and the churches need. And the best way we do that is by talking with your conference administrators. So we look forward to continuing working with you, and we certainly wish you God's blessing as you think about these things, as you look at the question, how do we do this in the most effective way? Because we want to see men, women, children won to Jesus' kingdom, because Jesus is coming soon. Yeah. All right, thank you. Damien.